In our session, we are going to reconsider and re-evaluate the borders of our discipline and its new roles shaped by the increasing influx of numerous social, technological, and environmental challenges. At the same time, the participants in the discussion will share with us their perception of the current architectural flows, emerging typologies, and contextual complexity. Has architecture become a tool, an interface, or cross-section of our turbulent epoch? Should architecture as a discipline become more introverted or extroverted? And can it be oriented both towards the urban and urbanism and the interior? Is there a real danger that the contemporary architecture might become too subordinated to new technological possibilities and remain ignorant about other ongoing processes in our fast-changing society? These are the questions which our participants and audience will try to answer. So the first part of our session will be the introductory talk given by Ingeborg, who is Associate Professor of Architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. She was already introduced, but still, I guess some of you are new here. So basically, she teaches design and gives courses and seminars on contemporary architectural theory and design techniques. She has taught at Princeton and at the University of Pennsylvania and was a visiting scholar at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Her theoretical work is devoted to questions regarding the impact of media on the perception, production, and thinking of architecture and has been published in numerous international magazines and books. Particular focus is given to information aesthetic and the architectures of the digital medium. Ingeborg Rocker is also, she was actually a project architect at Eisenman Architects in New York, and since 2005, with Christian Lange, she is a principal of Rocker-Lange Architects, an international operating design firm based in Boston and Hong Kong. After her introductory talk, we will have a discussion. And the participants of discussion will be Alejandro Zaera-Polo, who will join us via Skype. He's the Dean of Princeton University School of Architecture and co-founder of Alejandro Zaera-Polo and Maider Llaguno Architecture, an international practice based in London, Barcelona, and Zurich. He was a founding partner of London-based Foreign Office Architects. In addition to his teaching at Princeton, he has served as Dean at the Berlage Institute in Rotterdam and currently occupies the Berlage chairs at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands and the Norman Foster Visiting Professorship of Architectural Design at Yale University. Zaera-Polo has received many prestigious honors for his work, including the Heinrich Miralles Prize for Architecture, 5 awards from the Royal Institute of British Architects, the Venice Architectural Biennale Award, and the Charles Jenks Award for Architecture. The next participant is Sarah Whiting, who has been Dean of the School of Architecture at Rice University since January 2010. And prior to Rice, Whiting taught modern urban history, contemporary architectural theory, and studied at Princeton, Harvard, IIT, the University of Kentucky, and the University of Florida. In her writing, her teaching, and her practice, Whiting focuses on architecture's public audience and how architecture can engage that collective subject. Whiting's writing and editing has been published in numerous magazines and anthologies from Annie to Wired. She is currently completing a manuscript on scale and urbanism called Superblock City. Whiting co-founded WW with her partner Ron White in 1999, and she also worked with the Office for Metropolitan Architecture in the Netherlands and with Peter Eisenman in New York. Gabriele Mastrigli, our next participant, is an architect and critic. He investigates the relationship between architects, designing and writing, researching publishing as a critical form of architecture. He teaches theory and design at University of Camerino and architecture theory at Cornell University. From 2000 to 2008, he has been a consultant to the Italian Ministry of Culture's Department of Contemporary Art and Architecture. His articles and essays appeared in many magazines, including Domus, Log, and Lotus International. He has published Junk Space, a critical anthology of Rem Koolhaas' recent writings in Italian and French. In 2007, he was the curator of the exhibition Holland, Italy, 10 Works of Architecture, hosted by the Maxi in Rome. In 2008, he was among the curators of the Italian Pavilion at the 11th Venice Biennial. Our discussion has to be a bit shorter, so we have to finish around 5 to 7. But still, I hope it will be interesting. So please welcome again our guests and Ingeborg. Will be the first.
Thank you. Yeah, I have have quite a bit of a journey with you to do. Hope this is not too long. I titled it Autonomy, Futility as Objective. Futility could be translated with pointlessness, or autonomy, futility of the object. Peter's title was Futility of the Objects, as Scott just pointed out to me. Kind of knew this, but since we had this discussion on object and subject today, I think this would be irrelevant for me. The value of today's theory is that it mirrors prevailing trends. Its misery is that it simply rationalizes through a highbrow apologetics of conformity and banality, complacently mixed up with loose but fashionable talk about pluralism and respect for difference for the other. It ends up by clarifying electricism, converging up sterility and banality, and providing a generalized version of anything goes. This was a quotation from Castoriadis. What is then the relevance of the discussion of autonomous architecture today when anything goes in architecture? What is the relevance of the discussion of autonomous architecture today when architecture is increasingly entangled in transdisciplinary practices and projections? Should architecture attract attention, as Peter asked today? If so, to what extent should it direct our attention? Is autonomous architecture still possible today? Or is architecture always autonomous? Is perhaps anything autonomous? Autonomy in architecture cannot be limited to a single concept. However, autonomous architecture often refers to a particular quality or essence architecture may have, which is considered specific to it and which distinguishes it from other arts. Autonomous architecture focuses on the principles and norms internal to architecture. Architecture became autonomous in the sense that it was no longer motivated through external factors such as sociology, economy, politics, and technology. Much of the work of autonomous architecture is rooted in the analysis of urban and architectural precedents. However, different schools related different to history. And I take this from a introductory to an exhibition where 8 architects have been exhibited, which were considered autonomous architects. While the neorealists regarded history as a repository of images to be reused, the neo-rationalists, like Peter Eisenman, looked at history in respect to the discipline of architecture, its rules and principles that developed over the course of the years. I quote, "The essence of architecture is a set of rules or formal relationships that, although evoked by the architect, precede him. The work has an identity independent of the designer. Therefore, by virtue of this disciplinary independence, the work asserts its autonomy." It's a little bit the problem of the authorship we talked about before. So these are Peter's drawings from the first house, and I think this is probably the best overview we can get from it as you see the entire sequence. And you see also how we start out on the left side with the volume, the surface, and then the structure, of course abstracted, rooted in a commentary on modern architecture mainly. And then he works through us step by step, as we heard already, aesthetically chosen, through the different, I would say, paradigms of composition, which then interestingly leave traces inscribed upon each other and yet constantly undo each other. Eisenman's work refers to the past, the modern tradition, and yet also radically transgresses that tradition. Architecture is emerging in and through a process of sequential design strategies that continuously reinform the formal elements, line, surface, and volume. The resulting architecture is motivated through nothing else than the very elements and processes that have set it forth. Eisenman's early houses work like an algorithm in the sense that a clearly established set of elements undergoes a set of clearly established transformational rules. While the elements are abstracted architecture components, the process are equally abstracted architecture composition strategies. The final product of Eisenman's early houses presents and represents, consequently, quote, nothing but its own internal structures. It is, to a certain extent, authorless. The precise construction of ambiguities is one of the key characteristics of Eisenman's formal analysis of classical and contemporary works of architecture, and also turns into the generative ambition of his own work. The work was critiqued for its obsessive focus on process, for its self-referentiality, and for its search for architecture's essence. The work's strength, however, was the positioning of an architecture project, the refocus on architecture. And what I thought was very interesting to see that Eisenman Peter always works by looking at architecture, as we heard already today. And I thought particularly compelling was and how far he looks at Tehrani's work, which also was his PhD work, but also in how far this, of course, had an influence on his own production. So here are various ways of how you could possibly read Tehrani's works, how certain alignments and AB patterns could be read, or also how other patterns could be read. And depending on, you see here on the left side, for example, different discussions of how you could read the base, and then immediately you could see in how far that also affects his own work. Again, here, a little hard to see, it's on the bottom, I don't know, it's on the bottom of these drawings. Oh, you see it actually better in the projection, and I see it on screen. You can see how he varies also here, the AB pattern, which is, of course, inspired by his own reading of existing architecture, but also in commentary, I would think of the work by Common Row. So after this work of several houses, we see a shift in Eisenman's approach. Eisenman's approach changed in the subsequent houses from syntactic operations to decompositions. The work focuses on the negative, searching for the negative, the transgressive qualities to be found in classical architecture. And I assume we will talk more about this when I'm going to see the panel discussing Alberti. And through an inversion of the comprehension of the object and the process of its coming into being, the object is presented as void of any meaning, and the design process is rethought as a decomposition. For that, I was choosing the Cannaregio project. This act of decomposition does not know a type form, nor does it know a ground zero as an ultimate referent. Instead of finding the idealized in the past, Eisenman searches for the complexities and contradictions, for the anomalies, signals of another order. This other order shines forth when buildings suggest multiple forms of reading, of other readings, of anomalous readings. What's interesting about the Cannaregio project, it is the incomplete cube, the L, which is here interlacing. We not have only a single L, but multiple L's. And they then progressively start to interlock with each other. So we have a past, present, and future of different versions of the L. One could say it's an early versioning project. Here we see the entire complexity of the project. This is also, interestingly, one out of many instantiations of this project on the side. The project is, of course, in reference to an existing project, which is Le Corbusier's hospital in Venice. And Peter developed grit and also the overall placement strategies in reference to this project, which you see here is the train station. You see the tracks coming in, and then the Corbusier's project is on the top, the grit, and you can see then on the bottom how Peter draws from it the placement for his own project. Eisenman's work is autonomous in the sense that the objects produced are not only alienated from the process of their making, but they are now also alienated from themselves. So if we talk about the alienation of the object from its making, then this is, of course, a modern project in the way that there was the Marxian criticism that the worker is no longer in clear association with the product he puts forward, and therefore we could say there was an alienation implied in the process of the production of the object. Now here we have a double alienation, not only that the worker or the designer is alienated from the process of production because it's in a certain sense automated, but also the object itself is alienated as it exists in multiple versions of itself in past, present, and future. But they are now also alienated from themselves, precisely in the moment when the incongruent, multiple, ambiguous readings of them become possible. The objects decomposing has no referent, neither in the past nor in the future, The object as such is nothing but a trace of its process of becoming ungrounded, ungrounded in the sense of it only becoming ambiguously comprehensible. This making any ideal of clearly determinable identity or significance null. Object and subjecthood are equally thrown into question. Decomposition makes it impossible to decipher architecture in the traditional modes that would link architecture to a significance. By the 1980s, Eisenman's works highlights the crisis of reason and showcase relations of identity and non-relationships of identity overlap. For Eisenman, it is this overlap, the rupture with the traditional comprehension of identifiable presence, that marks the architecture's participation in reality. Eisenman's metaxy, or in-betweenness of existence, as Libeskind called it, recalls existence suspense as it is between the here, now, and the there, then. I would argue that participating in both creates a tension that ensures a new kind of autonomy in Peter's work. The indeterminacy of determined meaning, the determined motivation as it is explicated in and through Eisenman's architecture, is that which constitutes architecture's autonomy. Any meaning of architecture production is only temporal. Consequently, all decompositions arrive only temporarily at preliminary results, to re-enter in the ongoing process of making, the appearing and disappearing of architecture's futilized objects and objectives. The authentic, the essence of architecture, is thus no longer to be found in an imagined deep structure, but rather in the becoming differentiated, becoming architecture. That what was formerly seen as aberrant complexities and contradictions become now the expression of the newly gained sensibility of being ungrounded, of the very autonomous condition of being as such, of architecture as such, which is the project of autonomy. Now I'm coming to another project of autonomy, which is linked to typology. So I believe typology is today another important aspect to talk about. And this project is linked not to Peter, but to Aldo Rossi. Another notion of autonomy is provided by Aldo Rossi. While Eisenman's project was based in the analysis and abstraction of architecture precedents, whereby the project also becomes the president of its self and for itself in the search for the autonomous qualities of architecture, Aldo Rossi analyzed the political realm as it is played out in the city in order to critique and challenge capitalism through alternative urban constructs. While Eisenman's project was explicitly not political, Rossi's was always political. For Rossi's architecture, autonomy played out in typology to find rational form that related to disciplinary specificity and in urban places that counted the totality of urban planning in order to create a cultural alternative to the prevailing system of capitalist domination. Victoria Aureli wrote a really good book on this, can only advise you to read it. Since any building always already is also a direct production of the dominant system, Rossi sees in the device of the bare type, the stripped down type, an opportunity to comment critically on the existing conditions. Rossi's work is autonomous as it is a radicalization and purification of existing architecture types. With Rossi's work, the classical tradition is transformed insofar as it is emptied of its original significance and its body of rules and procedures, and the body of rules and procedures is itself subjected to formal manipulation. Typology received much attention in the debates about autonomous architecture, since it was considered as an integral support and catalyst of the discipline, given that architecture types could be promoted as both the discipline norms and conventions and the discipline's transformations and changes. So that's very important. Typology is both. It's an umbrella term which is rehearsing certain norms and conventions given through the discipline. At the same time, any type of architecture that kind of emerges as an instantiation of this very type is always particular. So it is both. It is a reincarnation of rules and norms. At the same time, it's always an interpretation as well. And that's where a kind of a transgressive power of typology could be seen. With each type's instantiation, the rules of the type became reinscribed, and yet each time they were expressed differently. A great diversity of architecture articulations were the result. While classicism and modernism still presumed an ideal type or an ideal prototype, autonomous architecture rethought type in the terms of a transgressive concept, in terms of types with possible past, present, and future instantiations. And for me, this is already a previewing of the idea of versioning, of course. Autonomous architecture also functioned as criticism. Autonomous architecture was linked to the social function of criticism in moments either when autonomous architecture would actively distance itself from the everyday context, critiquing, for example, the predominant formal, moral, or philosophical norms and laws given at the time, or autonomous architecture became critical towards a discipline through the utilization of modes of thinking and production that were foreign to the discipline. And that was most surprising for me, because you usually would think autonomous architecture is always very rooted in the discipline, but I even detected, I think, in Peter's work something other. In other words, the transdisciplinary borrowings from Peter Eisenman, I have to go quickly through the room, like the ones we looked already earlier at, I think, are enabling him to, again, arrive at an autonomous condition of architecture. So that could suggest that things which we today see as being outside of the disciplinary might actually also be utilized in order to arrive at an autonomous architecture condition. I'm going quickly through these because we've seen this already. Okay. I'm in particular thinking about the mathematical, computational, biological, philosophical concept Peter began to apply in and with his projects, and they almost paradoxically focused us and our viewing on architecture. So I think there is some hope for maybe some transdisciplinary influx without losing the idea of autonomous architecture. However, already the editorial in the Harvard Architecture Review of 1984 described the vulnerable condition in which the proponents of autonomous architecture were. This, I quote, "The theory has so far failed to spawn a method of political confrontation or for effective change." And of course, they refer here mainly to the project of Peter and others like him, probably less Rossi, as there was a little bit more of a political agenda. And out of this, I'm going now to transfer to the last part of my paper, which is looking into the reception and the criticism of the autonomous project. It was the same year in 1984 that Michael Hayes suggested a solution to what he described as a conflict between two different disagreeing camps that would be on one hand those advocates of the autonomy of architecture like Peter, and those who were thinking architecture rather as a cultural product, the Venturis and the Scott Browns. And Hayes suggested a compromise, and that one could call this compromise critical architecture. Situated between these different cultures, critical architecture challenged all those interpretations of architecture that sided either solely in the realm of culture or solely in the realm of form. Architecture as an, I quote, epiphenomenon dependent on socioeconomic, political, and technological processes, or the realm of autonomous form, need to conjoin in critical architecture. Critical architecture is interested in architectural objects situated within the world that can, quote, resist the authority of culture and stand against the generality of habit and the particularity of nostalgic memory and still have a precise intention, end of quote. As the idea of critical architecture and theory came to dominate the discourse and practice in the US during the 1970s and 1980s, advocates of building practices developed their project as a rejection of this theory-focused discussion and production of architecture. And by the time, also Eisenman had reinterpreted his earlier views on critical architecture, advocating in 2000 that the critical was now less a mode of resistance to a given status quo than a generative mode inherent to architecture. Now my last comments start, flights out of critical theory. By mid-1990s and certainly by 2000, both the project of autonomous architecture and the project of critical architecture were broadly rebuffed in what Michael Hayes described as different flights out of theory. There was the techno-managerial by Speaks, the post-critical, sorry for the term, Somel and Whiting, the new pragmatism, Allen, which was largely focused on architecture's material practices, often devoid of architecture, and Levin's projective practice, which shifted the focus from the architecture object to the subject experience the object. Today, we could say we have arrived in the thermodynamic era where we still wonder what the role of architecture could be. To Somel, the critical project had undone itself at the moment it turned into the discipline's dominant meta-discourse. Amid a disempowered critical, Somel envisioned the discipline afresh, with practice as something able to reorient architecture, scrutinizing it through an erosion of its discipline into surrounding design fields. Quote, "The slackening of the discipline is dissolution into graphic, landscape, product, interior, fashion, and urban design. And it's beneficial as all design fields are in the process of becoming one. What's becoming out of place is the role of discipline." End of quote. 2 years later, in 2002, Somel and Zaera-Polo suggested in notes around the Doppler effect and other modes of modernism a new paradigm, the projective practice. The term practice became loosely associated with the diagrammatic, the atmospheric, and cool performance. The effects and exchange of architecture inherent multiplicities, material, writing, atmosphere, form, technologies, economies were all of importance. Rather than commenting on the past, projective architecture was concerned with envisioning architecture futures soaked in a multiplication of contingencies. While in 2000 the dissolution of the discipline was celebrated, by 2002 Somel had to recognize that this more likely than not would, quote, "reduce architecture to the entirely amorphous role of the observer of heterogeneous life," end of quote. Somel and Whiting's argument needs to be seen in the context of Stan Allen's essay on the practice of architecture from 1998, which has perhaps one of the most important precursors which was perhaps one of the most important precursors to developments of 2000, when, with the last issue of the Critical Journal of Design Theory and Culture, Assemblage, the era of critical theory in architecture was brought firmly to an end. For Allen, the dominant discourse of critical architecture, with its focus on architecture as built discourse, was in danger of forgetting the specificities of building architecture. Critical, autonomous architecture and theory had caused a collective amnesia among architects, leading them, quote, "to forget about the specificity of building." For Allen, this confusion had to end in order not to lose architecture as material practice. The rebuff of critical architecture and critical theory has in the US successfully shifted the weight of the discipline to building practices. However, as the art of making became popular, this development coincided with a rather unfortunate, uncritical fetishization of building and fabrication processes. Architectural practices and their tooling often became an end in themselves. Quite ironically, the practice of architecture is at once celebrated and denied in the moment when it turns into either a representation, an image of the practices that brought it about, and I'm thinking about parametism, digital fabrication, or into building dressed up as architecture. I'm thinking about BIG. Such developments were neither intended nor advocated by those who had written first about them, Allen, Somel, and Zaera. Now, today we see a renewed interest in typology, parametric typology, or are those signs of a renewed interest perhaps in an autonomous and critical architecture? Could this even suggest a return of a critical theory that is more than a mirror of prevailing trends? Let's be provoked to find out more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingeborg. It's a very interesting introduction. Now we can start, initiate actually our discussion with Alejandro. Should we enlarge a bit?
Yeah, we need, Alejandro, we don't hear you well right now. 1 second.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
We have a serious problem here, which is that I cannot hear you at all. There is some problem with the... So basically, I am going to have very serious trouble to answer to Inge because I couldn't understand a word of what she was saying. The microphone is picking up is basically not translating the sound. I'm wondering whether I should try to fix this and then I can react to some of the other presentations.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have enough time for that, so maybe you should try to improvise somehow.
Alejandro, maybe you should just try it, and then in the meantime, we could have somebody else. You
Yeah.
don't hear us at all, or?
Yeah, maybe.
Sorry, I cannot hear you. When you talk on the room, I cannot understand anything. The microphone is not picking up the wrong notes.
Can somebody help us with that?
So he didn't hear your
It's
presentation at all?
only when you speak on the computer that I can understand what you are saying.
You should have said that right at the beginning.
Sure. Yeah,
That's a brag.
that's really silly. Why didn't you say it right away? That's right.
You should have interrupted him.
So he only hears us.
Why doesn't he just make a presentation
Yeah.
and not worry about you?
Alejandro, do you hear us now? You
Yes,
hear us?
I
Okay.
can hear you.
You know what? Peter just suggested that you present whatever your thoughts are on autonomy, and then we fill that in our other
Right.
discussions, maybe.
I mean, I can try to say something. I thought that my role was going to be to reply to yours, so I don't have much presented. But I can talk generally about maybe some discussions that I had in the past with Peter. I mean, I'm going to probably have to rely on things that has been already part of a long discussion that I had with Peter in the past. I think that Peter's position has been obviously one of the most polemical positions in the architecture debate in the last 3 decades at least, and I think that the main stance that he's taking, I believe to be that the discipline is per se a position of resistance that enables architects to confront and to evolve a certain status quo or a certain configuration of political power, and I think that that is certainly a possibility, and it is there is a strong possibility that obviously we can find in the exercise of the discipline a position of resistance towards the status quo. But probably the discussion that I would like to pose, or the position that I would like to pose here, which is something that I have been in some ways debating with Peter already for a long time, is whether you can conceive the discipline as something that doesn't consider power already as an integral part of it, as opposed to other disciplines, other artistic disciplines primarily. Architecture is more entangled with power probably than any other artistic discipline, and which means by by default we are in some way accomplices of power, because without power is almost impossible it's certainly impossible to, well, not certainly possible. I guess you can develop certain types of practice, but the practice of making buildings, of making structures, becomes very difficult without a certain alliance with power. And so the question that I would like perhaps to pose here is if whether autonomy by itself is almost an impossible thing to do in architecture, because it is a discipline that is in any way fundamentally tainted by power, and therefore the position of using the autonomy of the discipline as a position of resistance is per se almost an impossible position to help. I have been recently exposed to a certain debate which I think is relevant to this discussion, and I think interesting, and I would like simply to announce it in case it helps the room to discuss further the issue of the discipline, which is the fact that in some ways one of the problems that we have now in order to position the discipline in a position of resistance is the fact that the historical construction of the discipline has been primarily based on models of art history, which therefore are models that are perhaps not adequate to model the specificity of the architectural discipline as a discipline that is much more constituted at the core by the exercise of power. And I would like simply to pose the question of what is going to happen now with that historically constructed discipline of architecture in the age, for example, of big data or algorithms, when perhaps the capacity of acting as some sort of ground for inference of future behaviors of the practice is likely to be replaced by other devices. I think that if we want to still maintain a position of resistance or a position of transformation of the practice of architecture, and I believe that you cannot clearly delimit, or you cannot delimit so clearly the practice of architecture from the discipline. I think that this question of reconsidering power as an integral part of the discipline is a crucial thing today, and everybody knows that power is these days located in algorithms and the control of what is called the paradigm of big data. I mean, that's all I can improvise now, and I hope that if you can put the microphones closer to the computer, I will be able to contribute further to the debate. Thank you very much.
Yeah, but not everybody. You Gabriele is going to speak, Sarah is going to speak. You've
It will
spoken.
be a very nice, intimate meeting right around the computer.
Yeah, go ahead.
Alejandro, thanks to you, we have a very intimate gathering now, right next to all hands together.
I can hear you, Peter, very well now.
Yeah, okay.
You can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, so I'll move out of the way and let Sarah and Gabriele who want to talk.
Okay, let's come closer. Guys.
Go ahead.
Hi, Alejandro. And hello, everyone else. You're not going to sit there. Can you sit over there? I don't want you right behind me.
You see how I can reflect the evening from
Yeah, exactly.
Can you see Peter?
Don't be here.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
I'm not saying anything.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Alejandro. Now you've got Peter sitting right behind me. Yeah, so you do. So, first of all, since as everyone knows, oh, you don't hear me.
The mic.
Oh, here. Wait, no, I can use this mic. That's what I'm saying? All right. First of all, since already you know that I'm leaving tomorrow, I want to take this moment to say thank you. This has been very, very interesting already so far today, and I'm sorry that I have to miss tomorrow. On this topic of autonomy and disciplinarity, I want to sort of also thank Peter as a sort of autobiographical note. I've never been Peter's student. I started working for Peter, there's a funny hiss in the air, as his assistant when I finished my undergraduate degree, and that meant that I did everything from feed his cat to edit his writing. And in exchange, he taught me how to draw and convinced me to go to architecture school. And so it was a very significant year. But the main thing that he taught me in that office during that year was to have opinions, and to have opinions about architecture and to make choices. And so I think that your earlier comment about judgment is something that I want to talk about. But I also think that there's I think that part of what we have to talk about in talking about autonomy is the issue of interdisciplinarity, and this came up in Ingeborg's introduction, and I think that Peter's introduction of interdisciplinarity through first linguistics and then other fields, but I would say primarily linguistics, and the consistency with linguistics, I think is a very different form of interdisciplinarity than the interdisciplinarity today, which has diluted the field. And it's in part that Peter had the strength of the discipline behind him to be able to understand the relationship to these other fields and why they were relevant to architecture. I maybe think you are partly to blame, though, Peter, for that dilution through interdisciplinarity. I think that you maybe took it a little bit for granted, your own grounding in disciplinarity, and as a result, a lot of people behind you didn't realize that without that, simply becoming an expert on Chomsky or on Derrida or on Deleuze isn't the same form of what you were doing. And so I think that the relationship of the discipline, or let's say the burying of the discipline through interdisciplinarity is one issue. To respond very quickly to Ingeborg, I will just note for the billionth time that I've never used or endorsed the term post-critical. So I just want to correct that point. I do think that you laid out an interesting genealogy of a sort of critical, and I think that the introduction of the difference between Peter's criticality and Rossi's is extremely interesting to try and understand today. Power, Alejandro, I think that's a very interesting term. I agreed with you up to the point that you said that power is located in algorithms and big data, where I think that maybe because I'm based in Texas, I see power as being located in politics that are very different. And I think that we actually have to, as a practice, be very clear about what we're doing as architects to be able to respond to those issues of power. So I still think that even with your acknowledgement of the role of power in our field, I think that there has to be some specificity to our disciplinarity in order to play a role or respond to that power. So I do have some prepared comments for this session, and it really is about this question of judgment. So all of that is a sort of prologue, let's say, in terms of wanting to put this question of judgment back on the table. Exists partly also in my piece, the last piece for log that I did for Cynthia. But I think that understanding how we address this sort of question of interdisciplinarity today through disciplinarity and why disciplinarity is important. So one question really is how do you judge, or how do we judge in architecture? And it's a question that's rarely uttered out loud, although Peter asked it earlier, or brought it up earlier. Even though it's rarely uttered, it's the question that underlies all that we do in schools of architecture, as practitioners of architecture and critics of architecture. But how do we really know when a design is right? How do any of us decide whether a building is good or whether a building is bad? And I wonder if the question goes unuttered because it's too obvious or because it's anything but. Judgment is a very weighty term. It's very heavy, it's very fraught, and it provokes a bewildering aura when attention is drawn to it, much like the doubt that comes when trying to spell a word, when you think too long about how a word is actually spelled. Asking why a decision was made tends to guarantee a frozen panic. For all of our earnest bluster, self-conscious doubts run deep in the water of architectural production. Judgment makes us uncomfortable because it's judgmental. Open-mindedness is the de rigueur personality trait for our contemporary thinkers. No doubt we've long reaped the benefits of an ever-expanding interdisciplinary field. New topics, new voices, new disciplines, new geographies, and new politics have exponentially multiplied, establishing a richer and more beneficial world for all of us. And so to be judgmental seems utterly at odds with our new expanded horizon, which comes out of this interdisciplinarity. And yet, looking across architecture today, it strikes me that in our relentless pursuit of everything, we may have crossed the invisible line that separates proliferate good intentions from an avalanche of indiscriminacy. Because while we see more, we register less. Simultaneity has displaced singularity. We're no longer held back by the assumption that you can't rub your belly and pat your head at the same time. And even if we laughingly curse this condition of too much information, we feel more powerful for it. Armed with our smartphones, we can pepper our conversations with facts, with examples, and more importantly, with confidence. But while our information-packed world may be long on facts, it's short on opinions. And so how do you pursue architecture in such a milieu? Is it a like tag on an early morning surf through Arc Daily? Why like? Is it because of the project's beautifully formed concrete cantilevers? Is it the elegance of its sharply peaked form? Have you ever stopped to wonder why more than half the projects on Arc Daily every day seem to fall in one or both of these categories? Have you taken the time to wonder anything much about what you see on any of these blogs or any of these news feeds that you tune into? We're always short of time, so we surf, we skim, we survey our way through all information, architecture included, daily, even hourly. But does ever more equate with ever better? Has architecture advanced beyond what it was a year ago, a decade ago, a half century ago? Have our cities become better? Have we enhanced our cultural present, our prospective future? At first, this abundance of information was liberating. It offered an aura of something akin to intelligence. Proliferation itself became a methodology, and exhaustive grew to be the obligatory qualifier for research. Labor could be measured not in hours, but in the quantity of options produced. But prodigious output ought not to be mistaken for conceptual consequence. And far worse, the sheer multiplicity of our output might be muffling more urgently needed speculations about the future. Architectural judgments radiate from articulated and argued discourses. Across the 20th century, these discourses included, among others, technological optimism, good life modernism, populism, environmentalism, and for lack of a better term, brash capitalism. If the status quo felt stifling, one could always turn the status quo on its head. Less is more, not to your taste, no problem. How about less is a bore? Camps, the easiest way of identifying oneself, are also the easiest means of breaking ranks or of moving on. But camps bother us today. I want to live here, not there, has come to signal vulnerability or even incorrectness. But isn't it precisely that kind of desire, that kind of visceral subjectivity that leads us towards a tomorrow that is better than today? Architecture is about choices. It's about how architects negotiate the countless decisions that take place along the way from A to B. Does this look better than that? Should this fenêtre be en longueur? Should this room be next to that room? What is an institution? How does my project affect the person's individuality within it? Is concrete better than steel? Should I pay attention to context? Do I need a new font? Should that glass line up with that wall? That architects face a barrage of choices is nothing new, but we surely face more of them and from further corners of the world than at any previous moment in history. What has changed is that they render us more increasingly taciturn. We might be intentionally reserved. Architects are generally more diffident than they used to be. Or we might be paralyzed, overwhelmed by so many possibilities. Or we might have succumbed to a world of clients, banks, and project managers, power, Alejandro, whose rise to significance has paralleled architecture's diminished voice. Or we might simply be more selfish than we ought to be. The world has become so messy, why should we bother articulating our points of view? Whatever the cause, our muteness is particularly startling when one considers the fact that architecture is intrinsically generalist. Architecture is nothing other than a means of assembling relations across its many constituent threads, threads that are never the same in two projects. And the only hope that an architect has for making her way across that ever-changing turf is to be an expert at making decisions. Interdisciplinarity is not a judgment, it's simply a given. It's an exciting given, but at this point it's really a given. For it to be effective in advancing architectural practice and discourse, it's critical that we not let interdisciplinarity become an elaborate avoidance strategy for facing judgment head-on. We can't end our endeavors in perpetual ellipses. It's our role to teach our students to think, I'll do X, Y, or Z, to make considered judgments, not random choices that stem from careful, close readings from within and from without our discipline. These readings take time and take time to learn. It's also our role to construct that time in our world that never has enough time. If contemporary architecture seems complex, I'd argue that it isn't. If someone were to say that what we do is simple, I'd beg to differ. Architects decide how to add X and Y and then add that to Z. It's a process that's neither complicated nor simple, but it's one that takes practice, the practice of putting actual things together and the practice of thought that potentially advances rather than simply maintaining our discipline. It's a day-to-day life that's full of judgments. We evaluate things. We say this will be better than that or worse than that, and then we put things together in such a way that architecture supersedes all of these individual decisions with the conviction that tomorrow will be better than today, one judgment at a time. Thanks. So now we switch, you take this. No, you have to.
Well, there's so much density, in what we have already put on the table that is very actually difficult to choose, which aspect to better analyze. I would try to go through the all three talks in order to understand what was, to me, it's actually the best way of phasing a concept that is the problem of discipline or the problem of autonomy that is the fundamental problem we have to deal with when we talk about architecture, but when we talk about everything, I would say. So it's not something that is specific in regard of this discipline. It's very general. First of all, I would say that I really appreciated Ingeborg's presentation because it helps us, I think, to look at what happened in the last decades in terms of, at the same time, a very interesting and dense investigation within academy, basically, about our work, our job. But at the same time, especially when I've heard about all the history, let's say, in a very synthetic way, how these approaches to the discipline, I've seen also the risk of using that words as labels. We are autonomous, we are critical, we are post-critical, we are post-post-critical, and then everything become a sort of problem of belonging to different teams, like soccer teams, and we play and in a sort of league, and the problem is who won, who is winning, who is losing, and I don't think that it's helping really so much the discourse. On the other side, I think that what Alejandro stated as the relationship with power is the fundamental problem, in the sense that architecture, but I would say art in general, as since the beginning of the history of human beings, has had to do with power. From that point of view, I'm not sure that there is a real difference between art and architecture, in the sense that art in general, including architecture, has been since the beginning the fundamental representation of the attitude of humans, of asking ourselves why we do things. And we can express this attitude through paintings, through objects, through sculpture, and also through architecture. And that's, from that point of view, I think that there is an interesting, very crucial quote by Walter Benjamin, who said in a text that was about translation, the name is the task of the translation, the translator's task. No novel is written for the reader, no painting for the viewer, no symphony for the listener. And it can appear paradoxically that art is not made for the so-called users, but actually what is Benjamin stating here is the fundamental separation between the production of art and the experience of art. And I think that this is still valid even for architecture. The fact that the production of architecture and the experience of architecture in different belong to different moments, not only in times, but also in a different condition, basically. And this is a political issue, actually. This is a political issue because power, in a way, use architecture and art in general in order to define a certain position and a certain control or a certain relationship towards the society, but at the same time that's produced basically a battlefield, that can generate conflicts or negotiations, and this is actually what the problem moves to what we have already talking about this morning. That is about language. Language, exactly the moment in which this conflict and negotiation try to in a way arrive to a solution, whatever meaning we can attribute to the word solution. So I think that I completely agree that the problem of judgment today is relevant because actually not because we have to decide if we like one kind of architecture or another one, if we prefer actually one kind of form or another one, but because we have to, because judgment is a matter of an attitude, you know, it's a matter of confronting ourselves towards something we have in front, and this is, of course, in our case, it's architecture, and therefore it's a matter of being aware of what we are when looking at this thing, and what we are not, and there it's about taking decision about ourselves. It's not just taking decision about what we are looking at. And I think that what Peter was saying today, to learn how to see things. I study architecture. My experience, his experience of architecture is about how to see things. Is exactly about that. The subject is ourself, is the I, and the problem of the project, of the autonomy, you know, is the project of ourself.